we're going to start our studies for what will get us to Paper 2 on the IB exam and Paper 3 of the IB exam. For Paper 2, we are dealing with 20th century wars, their causes, their nature, like their practices, how the war takes place, and then the effects of the war. Paper 3 is history of the Americas. And so for both of those topics, World War II is going to be crucial for us to understand. On your standards that I've given you, you've got a number of standards that start with the word Americas. That means that the content within that standard is specifically addressing the Paper 3, History of the Americas, HL paper. So those of you that are SL, you probably won't use a lot of this information on your IB exam. Those of you that are HL absolutely could. So this is all about hemispheric relations, the relationship between the United States and other countries in the Americas in the lead up to the Second World War, both in Asia and in Europe. We're going to start today talking about Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, elected in 1932. Quick time out. Please recognize that American presidents are elected every 4 years, and the years of their elections are always multiples of 4 years. So we just had an election in 2016. That's a multiple of 4. 16 is a multiple of 4. 2020 will be the next one, right? There was one in 2012, multiple of 4. You need to keep that in mind so you can think about who the President of the United States is, essentially from Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 all the way through Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. That's everything we're going to cover between now and the end of the year. So you want to recognize that these guys serve 4-year terms. Traditionally, they're allowed to serve 2 4-year terms, but this guy's going to mess all that up. And those 4-year terms always begin on a multiple of 4 year, all right? Even if a president doesn't survive his term, his vice president will finish out the rest of it. There's not like a new election and a new start for another 4 years. Every president in the United States served only 2 terms at most up until we get to this guy. There was never any rule for this. It was just a precedent set by President George Washington, right? He steps down after 2 terms because he didn't want the presidency to look anything like a kingship, right? And so every other American president that might have had the opportunity to serve for more than 2 terms just kind of stopped running. Until we get to actually a distant cousin of Franklin Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a 2-term president. He was actually only elected 1 time, but he was elected in 1900 as William McKinley's vice president, and it's got to be 1900 because it's a multiple of 4 year. So it's got to be 1900 as William McKinley's vice president. And then McKinley's shot and killed, and so Teddy Roosevelt takes over for him. Finishes up, what?
Just gets elected and then gets killed in the same year.
Well, no, I don't think it's the same year. I think it's the next year, 1901. So McKinley's shot and killed, then Teddy Roosevelt is going to be the president, finish out McKinley's term, win his own term, and then be done, but actually he's going to leave the Republican Party. He's going to leave the Republican Party and start join a new political movement and try to win a presidency again. He doesn't, but his distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, will. Yeah?
So in the case of like the president dying
Yeah.
or something happens and the vice president has to take over, when the vice president takes over, does that count as their first term?
It depends. So let me do that with Franklin Roosevelt because it works perfectly with him. So Franklin Roosevelt will be elected in 1932. That's when the election is, right? Because it's a multiple of 4 year. Up here we see he's president from 1933 to 1945. Well, you're elected in November and then you take office, well, depending on when you became president, either in March in early American history or in modern American history in January. Now we do January for Inauguration Day. So you're elected in 32, you take office in 33. He serves a term. He serves a second term. And this is amidst the Great Depression, and then at the end of a second term, amidst the Second World War beginning in Europe and in Asia. And so he runs for a 3rd term, and he wins. And then he runs for a 4th term in 1944, and he wins. In 1945, he's going to die. In 1945, he's going to die. He has a brain hemorrhage, and he's out. He's done. And his vice president, his last vice president, a guy named Harry Truman, will take over for him. Harry Truman, as president, will finish out the remaining 3 years of, or 4 years, I guess, of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. All right? And at this point, the Constitution is going to be amended. The Constitution will be changed to only allow a president to serve those 2 terms. But in situations like Harry Truman's, if a president serves more than 2 years of the previous president's term, something happens, president dies or something, if the president serves more than 2 terms of the previous president's term, then that new president can, or more than 2 years of the previous president's term, that new president can only run for 1 re-election himself. Because it was more than half of the guy's term, he only gets 1 more term himself, 1 more time himself. If he serves less than half of the previous guy's term, he can run for his own election and then run for his own election again. So let's say hypothetically, something were to happen that would leave a vacancy in the current presidency, and let's say it happened. Let's say there was some resignation that happened, I don't know, next week or something, or maybe Congress started to move on some 25th Amendment rule. I'm just speculating. I'm talking about resignations. If that were to happen, the vice president, Mike Pence, would become president of the United States. And because it's only 1 year into the term of Donald Trump, Pence would serve out the remainder of Donald Trump's term. That would be 3 years. That's more than 2. So he would only have 1 term that he could run on his own. Hypothetically, if something happened, Donald Trump resigned 2 years and 1 day into his presidency. So that'd be what? Like January 21st, 2018. Or no, 2019. January 21st, 2019. 2 years and 1 day into his presidency, Mike Pence would become president. He would serve out the remaining 2 years of Trump's term. Then Pence could run for his own election, and then Pence could run for his own election again. So you could serve like just under 10 years less 1 day, right? Or maybe only 6 years, depending. Franklin Roosevelt is our only president to serve more than 2 terms. It can never happen again under our current Constitution. He's elected in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression. I think you all know about that, right?
He's a Democrat, right?
He's a Democrat. Very good. You're going to need to know their political parties as well. And Franklin Roosevelt and his administration will fundamentally change Americans and their relationship with the federal government. Franklin Roosevelt's administration, whether you're fond of him or not, he absolutely will change our relationship with our government. Prior to Roosevelt and his New Deal policies, and the New Deal, you might remember, is the series of plans and programs to try to pull the United States out of the Great Depression, it's going to tremendously grow the federal government. The federal government will become larger than it had ever been before. And it will become a more important part of regular people's lives than it had ever been before. The federal government will get involved in putting people to work through infrastructure programs. For example, we want to electrify the Tennessee Valley. We want to get rural electrification. And so or electricity, I should say. The federal government pumps money to build a bunch of dams in the Tennessee Valley area. And now they've got electricity there. The federal government will interfere in the banking industry to regulate and control the banking industry. The federal government, then, it's begun and it continues today, guarantees your money, ensures your money that you have saved in a bank. FDIC, very good. The federal government is going to create an old age insurance program called Social Security. So elderly Americans can stop working, leaving a job open for younger Americans, and the government will make direct payments to those elderly that are not working anymore. So Roosevelt will fundamentally change the relationship of the United States citizen with their federal government. Before the New Deal, most Americans weren't all that concerned with federal government policies. They didn't affect them all that much. Local and state was far more important. And now look where our country is. Many of us, many Michiganders, some might not know our governor. Many of us don't know our local representatives. We're not that connected to our local or state politics. But federal politics, national politics are front and center in our minds every day. So it all starts to change under Roosevelt. Yeah?
So does all that happen with the New Deal?
All that happens within the time frame of the New Deal. Yes. Yeah. So we're not here today to talk about the New Deal. This is not a discussion on the Great Depression. I just want to give you a little background on Roosevelt and what he's coming into. So because he has to deal with the Great Depression, foreign policy issues for most Americans are going to take a back seat. It's a reality, guys. We are far less concerned with global issues, with global affairs, if we don't know where our next meal is going to come from. If we don't know how to put food on the table, if we don't have a job, we're going to not spend too much time concerning ourselves with issues in foreign lands. And that's where America is during the Great Depression in the 1930s. Congress, elected by those Americans, is also very isolationist, staying out of foreign affairs. We've got an Atlantic Ocean to our east and a Pacific Ocean to our west, and we are largely trying to stay out of European and Asian affairs. When we say we are isolationists, though, it does not mean we're not doing business with foreign countries. We are interested in trading with foreign nations. But even with that, the Great Depression has had an impact. Because the United States has less to trade with foreign nations. Or I should say, they are willing to buy less of our products because they're going through a depression as well. And one solution we attempted to solve the problems of the Great Depression and to protect American industry was to do what during the Herbert Hoover administration?
Tariffs.
Slap a protective tariff on imported goods. And the biggest, we've already talked about in here, called the Hawley-Smoot tariff, right? Remember that? We talked about it? The Hawley-Smoot tariff. It's a tax on imported goods. Problem with those tariffs is if we put tariffs on one country's goods, they're going to probably return the favor to us. And it's going to drive all of these goods prices up. So with the backdrop of a global economic depression and in the 1930s threats that the age of internationalism of the 1920s have now passed us by. You've got a Japan in 1931 that invaded Manchuria. You've got a Germany that's remilitarizing in Europe. It seems that things are getting a little bit tense, all right? The United States is going to change, under Franklin Roosevelt, is going to change our policy and our attitudes towards our Latin American neighbors. If you recall, prior to Roosevelt, prior to the 1930s, the United States did not have a very good relationship with Latin American countries. How would you guys characterize America's relationship with our Latin American neighbors prior to the 1930s? Hostile, colonial, imperial. We were like imperialistic. Can you guys give me any specific examples of things that the United States might have done? Cuba. Okay, the Platt Amendment in Cuba. Cuba gains its independence. We helped them craft a constitution. And within there, we put a clause that says, if your rights aren't ever being protected, we reserve the right to intervene. So if Cuba is not being run the way we think Cuba should be run, we have the right to intervene. Any other examples of America's dealings with Latin America that might have been a little heavy-handed?
Mexico.
What with regard to Mexico?
The quota. Well, before that, during the 1800s.
Oh, we literally went to war with Mexico and took a massive chunk of their territory, yeah.
And that's a huge section of Texas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you guys know anything about Panama?
Yeah, the Canal, baby. They were like, Colombia, never mind, it's Panama.
Yeah, you've got this country called Colombia with this crazy appendage hanging off of the northern part of Colombia that we today call Panama. The United States fomented revolution amongst Panamanians. We talked to the Panamanians, they're like, you guys should really be in your own country. Look at your shape, it's so weird. And you guys are dragging along that big ball and chain of Colombia, right? And Panamanians were like, yeah, you're right. And we supported their independence movement. We supported their revolution. And they won. There was one string attached, though, and that's, for our support, we want a little narrow strip of land through your country that we can dig a canal. This is the country of Panama. There's the Panama Canal. It surprises many people to notice that the Panama Canal actually runs north and south. That's the most narrow point and the easiest to dig that canal. So to get from east to west via the Panama Canal, you actually have to travel south through the canal. So anyway, the United States has long had these policies where we acted pretty heavy-handed with our Latin American neighbors. Roosevelt's going to change that. Roosevelt's going to change that. And this is what is known as President Roosevelt's Good Neighbor Policy. The Good Neighbor Policy is the American attempt to foster a better relationship with our Latin American neighbors in order to hopefully improve economic relations, because everybody's going through the Great Depression. Maybe if we can foster better trade relations with these countries, that might improve everybody. So we want better economic relations, and we want to make sure if the going ever got rough in Europe or in Asia, if any wider conflict were to break out, we want Latin American countries like us to stay out of it. We don't want any of them getting involved in the war. Because we've got a good memory of what happened during World War I. Do you guys remember a story called the Zimmerman Telegram about World War I?
Mexico.
Ms. Woodcox, do you remember what that was all about? Yeah. Who's they?
Germany.
Boy, I'm not talking to you. Yes, Germany. And they sent a message to Mexico, right? They said to Mexico, if you, Mexico, invade the United States, this is in 1917, if you invade the United States and occupy their armies, because Germany was afraid that we were about to join the war effort anyway, if you invade the United States and keep America's armies busy, when we win this war, we will support your claims to regain all that territory the United States had taken from you in the 19th century. The British intercept it, they decode it, and they send it to the Americans. Now, the British really wanted us to get involved in the war, so the British knew what they were doing too. They wanted us to join the war, but on the British side. And the British were hoping that this would so anger us against Germany that we would jump into the war.
And we did.
And we did, right? We also made it clear to Mexico that you should not be playing this game. And Mexico didn't play that game. So we've already got a little bit of history where European countries tried to get American countries involved in a European war. And we wanted to make sure that wouldn't be happening again. Hence, the good neighbor policy. So let's run through really quickly about a few meetings that were had between Latin American nations and the United States and what will ultimately result from this good neighbor policy. First, in Uruguay, 1933. Uruguay. Montevideo, Uruguay, 1933. What is known as the InterAmerican Conference. Here in 1933, the United States and Latin American countries will agree that nobody has a right to intervene in a country's internal or external affairs. Everybody in the Americas is sovereign. No one has the right to intervene in a country's internal or external affairs. Stay out of our business, and we'll stay out of yours. This is going to mark the change, officially, from previous programs and policies, like the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, if you remember that from last year. Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, where we will push you around to ultimately get what we want. Or maybe you remember Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. That it was like a moral imperative that we try to shape Latin America in a way that we see fit. Because we are doing it right, and we should have them follow our way. Now we are saying, you know what, Latin America, we'll stay out of your business. So going forward, we're going to see some impacts from this good neighbor policy. The United States will pull American troops that had been stationed in many Latin American countries. We had troops in Haiti. We're going to bring them back home. We have troops in the Dominican Republic. We're going to bring them back home. Yes, sir?
Can we nullify the Platinum Amendment there?
Next, we will nullify the Platt Amendment. Thank you. In 1934, we will nullify the Platt Amendment, ending the United States' essential occupation of Cuba. We will work to repeal some of the trade barriers that have been created between the United States and other Latin American countries. Some of those tariffs will start to draw back. In 1936, we mentioned that Panama Canal. We will renegotiate a Panama Canal Treaty, where the United States would agree to exit Panamanian politics. And we would stop our attempts to seize more territory in Panama. We would also agree to pay more rent to the Panamanians for the canal zone. In 36? Yeah, we're keeping that. We're still allowed to be in the canal zone. We're paying the Panamanians rent for it.
So what is this?
This is the Panama. We're renegotiating what's called the Panama Canal Treaty. So yay, we're like being a better neighbor to Latin American countries, right? And is this because we're like really nice guys?
No.
Maybe, but remember, everybody's got a motive. Franklin Roosevelt might really be nice, but he's also dealing with a depression. He wants better economic relationships, and we're dealing with European and Asian threats. So we want to make sure everybody stays out of those fights. So you can be nice and have ulterior motives at the same time, right? Two birds with one stone, I think we call it. Or maybe it's just an ulterior motive. But if an ulterior motive results in better relationships, is that a bad thing?
No.
Okay. Sure. All right. In 1936, we'll have another meeting, this time in Buenos Aires, which is in? Argentina. Very good. Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1936. By 1936, the world has started to change a little bit. We've got a civil war in China. We've got a civil war beginning in Spain. We have an Abyssinian crisis. Italy is now taking over Ethiopia. President Roosevelt himself will go to South America, and here you can see him speaking to the crowd here. He spends an entire month touring Latin America. The results of this end in all American nations agreeing to consult each other on hemispheric threats. When I say hemispheric threat, anything that is threatening anybody within the Western Hemisphere. So they'll all talk to each other and try to work out any issues that might arise. These nations will also sign a neutrality pact in the event that a conflict would arise. So if there's a European war or an Asian war, the countries of the Americas will stay neutral. They'll stay out of it. They won't pick a side. Yeah?
Unless somebody attacks them.
We'll get there in a second. So neutrality in terms of a European or Asian conflict. 2 years later, there's another meeting, this time in Lima, Peru. It's called the 8th Pan American Conference. Here, the American states will work to create a collective security agreement. This goes a step beyond a neutrality pact. Neutrality means I'll stay out of your war. Collective security means if someone attacks me, all of my allies I've signed this collective security pact with will stand beside me. making it much harder for anybody to ever attack me. If I know if I were to attack Brandon and he had a collective security agreement with everybody at this table, I wouldn't just be fighting Brandon, I'd be fighting all 5 of these guys. And look at how tough they are. So I would want to stay. Oh my goodness. Hey. You know what? Yes, sir.
We had a power failure.
Okay.
No, we didn't actually. We blew a fuse. And Natalie slept through her alarm, so she didn't come to school.
Yeah.
Do you want her to just meet you guys at Stevenson? Or do you want her to come here?
Meet at Stevenson. Okay. Sorry about that.
Sorry, guys.
Worst video ever. So anyway, at the 8th Pan American Conference in Lima, Peru in 1938, there's going to be a collective security agreement. If any of these American countries are attacked by an outsider, then all of the American countries would stand with each other. Now wait a minute, I thought the League of Nations kind of did something like this.
But U.S. is not.
Okay, we never joined the League of Nations. Good. 1, we never joined the League of Nations. 2, how's the League of Nations doing by 1938? It hasn't defended Manchuria. It hasn't defended Abyssinia. Countries like Japan and Italy and Germany are just leaving it and doing their own thing. Probably not going to defend you. So out of this Pan American Conference, countries in the Americas agree to the mutual defense of each other. They will also draft what's called a Declaration of American Principles. Non-intervention in state affairs. Stay out of everybody's business. We've already said this, but now it's declared at this next conference. Stay out of American affairs. United States, don't mess. Brazil, don't mess. Stay out of other countries' affairs.
What's this called?
The Declaration of American Principles. 2, peaceful settlements of differences. We will have a peaceful settlement of our differences. There's something like it. It's just different now. An Organization of American States. We'll talk about that later in the year. No use of force. Kind of like a Kellogg-Briand Pact for the Americas. And a pledge towards international cooperation. So, yay! We've got now better relations with our Latin American neighbors, and we call it the good neighbor policy. Everyone good? Good.
Can you repeat the Declaration one more time?
All 4 of them?
No, like the Declaration one.
Declaration of American Principles.
Okay.
That's it. 1938. All right. Second and final topic for today is American neutrality, U.S. neutrality from foreign wars. In 1917, the United States went to war in Europe, right? We joined World War I in Europe. You guys studied this a little bit last year, and my guess is you studied 2 main reasons the United States got involved in the war in Europe. What do you recall from last year?
Lusitania.
Okay, we can't just say Lusitania, because that happened in 1915, and so we got a couple years before we actually declare. But the Lusitania is an example of unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans using their U-boats to sink passenger liners or any ship that they choose, sometimes American ships even, sometimes ships with Americans on them. So that annoyed us, unrestricted submarine warfare. And shortly after the Lusitania was sunk, Germany had promised not to do that anymore. They'll take a break. But as the war started going longer and longer than anyone thought it would, Germany realized the only way they can win this war is by resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. So they resumed it. We were irritated. We go to war. We also talked about the Zimmerman note, right? Well, in 1935, the American Senate would task this man, Gerald Nye. He's a senator from Wisconsin. He would task Gerald Nye to lead a Senate investigatory committee. The Senate is allowed to investigate whatever the heck the Senate wants to investigate. Right now, you guys know that there's some investigations going on in the American Senate and in the House with regard to the election in 2016 and possible collusion or Russian involvement or whatever. Russian interference in the 2016 election, yes. So these investigations happen. In 1935, Senator Gerald Nye is going to be tasked with looking into why the United States got involved in the First World War. And it's got to go deeper than what everybody knows from their school books. Unrestricted submarine warfare, Zimmerman note, we joined the British. So the Nye, what's called the Nye Committee, will investigate why we got into the war. And their results say it was more economic than anything else. For example, at the start of World War I, we were a neutral country. We stayed out of that fight. But as a neutral country, we did business with both belligerents. A belligerent is anybody fighting a war. So we traded with Britain, we traded with France, we traded with Germany, we traded with Italy, we traded with whoever wanted to buy stuff from America. But as the war waged, all right, we found it harder and harder to trade with Germany. Why would it be hard to trade with Germany during World War I?
Royal Navy. Submarine.
Kind of, but...
Royal Navy.
Okay, what does the Royal Navy do?
It attacks U.S. ships en route to Germany.
Royal Navy's not attacking too many of our ships, yeah?
The Jutland blockade.
Very good. The British Navy is going to blockade Germany. They're not going to let any ships, any merchant ships or any other ships, make it through what's known as the British blockade of the North Sea. So even if we wanted to trade with Germany, we can't get the stuff there. And yes, the German U-boats are going to try to sink American merchant vessels on their way to Britain, and they will sink many of them. So as the war goes on, we are trading far more with Britain than we are with Germany. Because we can't literally get anything into Germany. So we trade with Britain. But as the war is being fought, Britain doesn't have a whole lot of money and resources to fight this war with. So how are they buying goods from America? We're loaning them money. We're loaning them money. Yeah? Yes. Yeah, it's like giving them a credit card for weapons, all right, or for any supplies they need during the war. So we are loaning the British money to buy stuff from American companies to ship across that will support their war effort. Which means as we're getting deeper into the war, we've got a lot of outstanding debt or outstanding loans to Britain and to France. And we want those loans paid back. Which gives us, according to the Nye Committee, which gives the United States a vested interest in having the British and the French win World War I. Because if the Germans won World War I, would we ever get our loans paid back? No! Germany's going to take everything from Britain. We won't get our money paid back. So we need the British to win World War I so we can get our loans paid back. And this is what the Nye Committee reports on. And this committee report will shape American neutrality laws going forward. It solidifies an American population that was already against getting involved in foreign affairs, and it makes it even more of a strong stance against getting involved in any foreign conflict. Because who really benefited from this war? American banks, the American Treasury that needed to have its loans repaid, wealthy Americans, wealthy investors. Who suffered from the war? Regular people that had to go off and fight and die. Right? We had over 100,000 of them. It's bad. It's bad news. So with the Nye Committee report in 1935, America that was already isolationist is going to become even more so. And our Congress will start to pass a series of Neutrality Acts over the next couple years that will progressively keep us further and further from getting involved in European conflicts. All right? I'm going to run through 4 of these Neutrality Acts today. If you're looking for a 4 or a 5 on your IB exam, I think it's a good idea to know that the Neutrality Acts existed and that they progressively got more restrictive on what we could do. If you're going for a 6 or a 7, you want to know what these Neutrality Acts actually did. First, 1935, the first Neutrality Act. Just like Rocky 1 isn't really called Rocky 1, it's just Rocky. The 1935 First Neutrality Act is just the Neutrality Act. That's it. We don't really consider it the first until we have a second coming the next year. So anyway, the 1935 Neutrality Act gives the American president the power to prohibit American ships from carrying American-made weapons to nations at war. It doesn't mean they're banned, but it means the president can step up and say, no, your country's at war, we will not sell you or ship you these weapons during your fight. It's a pretty tame Neutrality Act. It just gives the president the option to stop shipping weapons of war to countries at war. It also says that American citizens who are traveling on foreign ships that are at war, or what we call belligerent ships, if you're an American traveling on a British ship, kind of like any of the Americans that were on the Lusitania in 1915, you're traveling at your own risk. You're making a decision to travel there on your own. Today, the United States will make travel restrictions, right? Like, as an American, we're not really supposed to go to North Korea. Iran is a country that we're not really free to go to. And if something goes wrong, like if we go to North Korea and we kind of get stuck there, the government, has already kind of said, don't go to North Korea, American citizens. And if you get into some trouble there, it's not like we're going to go to war to get you out, all right? Hopefully not. But our government has the power to put these restrictions on foreign travel for American citizens.
Are they going to help us if we get trapped in like Iran? Or
They may not. They may not. They may talk and try to go through diplomatic channels, but they're not obligated to, okay? They're not obliged to. So anyway, that's the first Neutrality Act, just giving the option to the president to not allow certain things to be sold to countries at war. Second Neutrality Act, 1936. Now we've got like a Spanish Civil War starting up, all right? Things are starting to get a little hot and heavy in Europe. And please remember that the Spanish Civil War is not really just a Spanish Civil War. Soviet Union's going to send troops to it. Eventually, Italy is going to send troops to it. Germany is going to send its Condor Legion. Yes?
Really quick, which side of Germany which side of Germany support?
The nationalist side, the side of Francisco Franco, not the side of the government.
The rebels.
But yes. So the second Neutrality Act will take it a step further. It will now ban loans or credits to any countries at war. The United States will not make any loans to any nations that are currently fighting in a war. That's why we got into World War I. We had loaned Britain money, and we wanted that money paid back. So now we won't loan anything to anybody fighting in war.
So it bans loans to belligerents?
Yep. Companies could still trade with foreign nations, with warring nations. But there would be no government loans to countries at war. Yes?
Why do they feel the need to keep making more and more strict?
Because the situation in Europe got more and more tense, right?
What year was this?
36. 1937, a third Neutrality Act. Now we will outright forbid the trade of munitions, weapons of war, arms, to either side in the Spanish Civil War. We do not want to get involved in that conflict. So, either side in the Spanish Civil War. Either side fighting in the war. Other goods would still be okay. Other goods are still okay. We can send them food, we can send them medicine, whatever. But not weapons of war. But the other goods, if Spain or any of the belligerents fighting in the Spanish Civil War are going to buy anything else, they have to pay for it in cash. They have to pay for it in cash, so we're not loaning it to them. And they have to carry it on their own ships. This is called the cash and carry provision. They have to pay cash, they have to carry it on their own ships, so American ships aren't going in harm's way. Later in 1937, a fourth Neutrality Act. Now it gives the power to the president to go even beyond weapons of war, to any other goods that he could forbid shipment of. So the president could determine anything that could be restricted from shipment to a country at war. It will also make any Americans travel on foreign belligerents' ships. Like if a country is at war and we've got Americans traveling on their ships, that will be illegal for Americans. Yes?
How is this different from the protectionist tariffs?
Because it's just dealing with countries at war specifically. So it's not affecting trade or loans or anything else to countries that are not at war. So it will now be unlawful for Americans to travel on these foreign belligerents' ships. So we've got this series of Neutrality Acts up through 1937 that are pulling the United States further and further from getting involved in these foreign affairs. But are we really staying that neutral? Are we really staying that neutral? And here's where we want to talk for a moment about what's going on in Asia in 1937. Japan invades mainland China. It's the Second Sino-Japanese War. Neither nation, neither Japan nor China, declared war in that conflict. And so according to the Neutrality Acts, they don't apply to this story in China. Because the Neutrality Acts talk about not doing business with countries at war. And even though what's happening in China looks like a war and smells like a war and sounds like a war, it's not a declared war. Japan just invaded. They never made a declaration of war. China is fighting against Japan, but never formally declared war against Japan. So Franklin Roosevelt, who does not like the idea that Japan has now invaded China, supports China and sends arms shipments to them. Many in Congress are outraged at this. How could you? You are violating the spirit of the Neutrality Acts. But he's not violating the law because it wasn't a declared war. So we do actually get involved in the Sino-Chinese or the Sino-Japanese War, and we send arms into China for their defense. Now, at the same time we're sending arms to China, we're also selling oil and steel and coal to Japan. So, we're sending to both sides. Roosevelt is concerned about the spread of totalitarian governments. It's happening seemingly in Asia. It's happening, we see, in Europe. But Congress does not support intervention. They didn't with the first Neutrality Acts. They still don't after Japan invades China. 70% of Congress was opposed to, or thought, I should say, American involvement in World War I was a mistake. 95% of Congress thinks we should not be getting into a future war.
Can the president just act as commander-in-chief and send troops?
Not at this point. Not at this point. Not without congressional authorization. Later in the 20th century, we will be able to do that for a limited amount of time. In October of 1937, Franklin Roosevelt gives what's called the quarantine speech. October of 1937. Oh, wow, that's like, what, 80 years ago this month. October of 1937, FDR gives what's called the quarantine speech. He explains to the American people what's going on in Asia. And he said that the United States should quarantine or isolate aggressive states, to put economic pressure on aggressive states. But no real action will come from Congress following his speech.
Which states?
Aggressive states like Japan. And so nothing really changes for the United States. We are supporting giving limited support to the Chinese, but we're really staying out of any conflict. We also mentioned that Panay incident, and that happens around the same time here, when an American ship is going to be sunk by a Japanese bomber. That is going to solidify some anti-Japanese sentiment, but not enough to get involved in a war yet. As the crisis in Europe is getting worse, some Americans start to support the idea of supporting Britain and France against German aggression in Europe. Roosevelt especially. Roosevelt would love to support our British allies as Germany is getting more and more aggressive. But in 1939 and in 1940, Roosevelt just does not have the popular support, nor does he have the congressional support to act on that. All right? Now, of course, 1941 and the attack on Pearl Harbor is going to change this story. But before that attack on Pearl Harbor, we just don't have the congressional support for involvement, deeper involvement in this war yet. After the Munich Pact is signed, however, after Adolf Hitler is going to be gifted the Sudetenland, President Roosevelt is going to call for an increase in the defense budget of the United States to start to rebuild our military, which was actually quite small in the late 1930s, because why do we need a big military? Canada and Mexico aren't threats to us. But here we have the end of the 1930s and a relatively isolated United States staying out of foreign affairs. And our friend Dr. Seuss had something to say about this. Dr. Seuss did a lot of political cartoons in the late 1930s and then through World War II. And here he is, this guy is selling ostrich bonnets, ostrich hats. Because what do we know about an ostrich? What does he do when he's scared? They bury their head in the sand. So an ostrich becomes like a metaphor for somebody who buries his head in the sand. Means I don't want to look at my problems, I don't want to deal with my issues, I just want to ignore it, right? And so we are always suckers for ridiculous hats. This guy is selling the ostrich hats to forget the terrible news you've read. Your mind's at ease in an ostrich head. And all of these Americans are buying these hats and then just sticking their head in the sand and avoiding it. Do you think Dr. Seuss wanted intervention, or do you think he liked isolationism? He was a big supporter of interventionism. All right? We'll talk more about that at our next class.